When Sanguinius drove his blade into Horus's heart, history screamed, because the angel had just killed the future itself. The sound was not like any cry of mortals. It was the tearing of a covenant, the shredding of possibility, a vacuum where 1,000 destinies had once gathered. In the vengeful spirit's throne chamber, the light failed to catch the fallen Warmaster's face with mercy. It burned him into an icon broken, human, utterly bereft of godhood. Sanguinius stood above that ruin and felt the universe incline away from him, as if even fate needed distance to breathe. The corridor that had borne him inward pulsed with after-images, echoes of the duel that had no right to have finished the way it had. The web of causality that tethered time to consequence quivered. Somewhere in the Imperium, a chorus, ancient and patient, paused mid-chant, unsettled by a note struck outside the intended scale. The angel's wings hung heavy, feathers trembled like black banners in a wind that had stopped being wind. He had not gone there to murder a version of his brother that the galaxy loved to hate. He had gone to end a horror, to stop the Warmaster's ascension to mythic ruin. He had gone because in the fissure between love and duty he could not stand the thought of more blood spilled in the name of prophecy. He had gone because he believed that stopping Horus would stop the wheel, halt the march that would grind humans into legend and then ruin. He had gone because he was Sanguinius, beautiful, furious, unbearably human. When the Emperor stepped through the teleport shimmer, the air changed again. The custodians materialized with all the stiffness of carved stone, auramite gleaming, faces unreadable behind their masks. The Father's presence folded the room into smaller spaces, private and terrible. He saw the corpse. He saw the angel above it. He saw, finally, the emptiness the act had made. He did not speak. Sanguinius opened his mouth. The words broke like glass in his throat. He had no script for this scene where fate buckled, because mercy won the duel with design. He had nothing to narrate the ruin he'd wrought. A Warmaster felled before his myth could bloom, a story amputated at its root. The Emperor's eyes, which had watched suns die and civilizations forge themselves, found his. They were ancient wells that had once mirrored strategy and calculation. In that instant, a shard of something else glinted the cold calculus of necessity. It was as if time itself had a debtor's ledger, and the balance had to be closed. Nothing could be repaired in that silence. The vengeful spirit, which should have erupted into the orchestral apocalypse of Horus's final apotheosis, instead seemed to retract, like a wound refusing to be licked by the light. The traitor legions were left to flounder like creatures cut loose from their tidal pull. Some fled, hunting for refuge in the eye. Others fought on with the kind of bitter, purposeless fury that finds meaning only in pain. Terror endured, the siege ended, but victory arrived with a mouthful of ash. They came back to Terra. The Emperor returned in flesh, still whole, still terrifying in his mortal completeness. He walked among the survivors, commanders, tired custodians, priests whose prayers had been arranged in rows for an end that now refused to obey scripture. He watched as the story that should have made him beyond question failed to materialize. People saw their Lord as a man again, magnificent, inscrutable, fallible. Faith bent but did not break. It did not harden into the unshakable thing that legends make. Worship flared, but it was thin and human respect, without the mythic scaffolding necessary to bind an empire across 10,000 worlds. Sanguinius felt the consequences ripple outward like a new kind of contagion. He had imagined the throne as an altar, the Astronomican as a beacon of absolute, clinical clarity. But when he allowed himself to be made the instrument, the light that bled from him carried something else, his grief, his hunger for justice, his deep and ruinous tenderness. The Astronomican became a sentience of feeling as well as signal. Navigators hearing it felt hope the way a child feels it, blinding, irrational, corrosive. They felt anger where none should exist, pangs of mourning for battles yet to be fought. The beacon guided ships no less, but it made sailors susceptible to sense and soul things never intended for strategic compasses. Across the Imperium, subtle calibrations began to fail. Not the clocks of chronometers or the metallurgy of engines, but the deeper architectures, the rituals that had kept and ordered human empire together. Where once the Emperor's necessity had been a cold blade of policy, the new order felt warmth at the hilt. Bureaucrats who had been trained to cut entire populations from a ledger now paused, fingers hovering as if feeling for a pulse. The administratum acquired a conscience the way some machines acquire rust. The Inquisition found debates they had not known they could entertain. Compassion became an electioneer at strategy's table, and Coryphai, who had never allowed themselves to call anything sacred, now found themselves naming it aloud. And the Adeptus Astartes changed. Blood angels looked skyward and recognized in the Astronomican a voice that sounded like their father's last face. The red thirst, the viral, venomous hunger in their genes that had always lurked like a wolf, began to sing new verses. It was as if the angel's flame pried open wounds in the soul of the chapters. Brothers who had never seen Sanguinius in person felt his heartbeat in their marrow. Where the Emperor's will would have reinforced discipline, the angel's echo sowed longing. They fought with honor, but they fought as those who feel each kill in the sinew of their being. The black rage visions of the angel killing the Warmaster over and over grew, too, fed by Sanguinius's psychic imprint on the beacon. But unlike the contained tragedy that might have been, this was a pandemic, a psychic contagion that leapt beyond bloodlines because the Astronomican had become an agent of feeling. Sanguinius felt each descent. It wounded him more than any blade. He sat in the golden throne like a sun caught under glass. He burned without release. Every scream in the death companies was another drafting into his conscience. He had believed being upon the throne could be an instrument of salvation. Instead, it made him a transmitter of suffering, broadcasting the worst parts of himself across the warp. He could not stop it. The machinery ate privacy. It translated empathy into signal. Chaos watched and waited. The gods had expected a different narrative. Horus elevated, the Emperor broken, an idealized descent into myth that would make worship and damnation into a single coin. Fate had given them instead an angel on a throne and a living emperor in a walking world where men whispered rather than bowed. The dark powers were patient. They are the slow rot that prefers to feast rather than feast now. They tasted the angel's compassion and found it an entree. Corn fed on the rage that flickered like faulty circuitry through chapters gripped by the red thirst. Nurgle harvested the pained, clotted hope of entire populations who could not bear to watch their children die and thus made bargains for survival. Tziench threaded prophecy into confusion, spinning new plots from the one that had been cut. Slanesh smiled at the beauty of the tragedy suffering transfigured into worship, worship into ecstasy. From the palace, the Emperor watched it all. He wandered like a man who had to keep studying the world he had made to understand what he had become. He attempted adjustments with the clinical mind that had built legions and laws, but knowledge can only go so far when faith, once set in motion, becomes a force outside policy. He tried to correct charts, reorder rituals, recalibrate the Astronomican's attunement to emotion, but each attempt pried at a reality that none of his instruments could stitch. The beacon's signal, now sentiment as well as calculation, resisted sterilization. It is a peculiar horror to be loved but not understood. The Emperor felt the humanity around him become something other than the machine of conquest and governance he had envisioned. He was seen as a living man, and in that new humanity he was denied the eternal right to make cold choices. In his quietest moments, he would stand before the throne and look at the thing he had contrived, and the thing would look back a son of love and pain nested in circuitry. Fathers can be monsters as readily as gods, and the line is drawn in the choices they make. On the vengeful spirit's corpse, the consequence of a single impulsive mercy fanned into the slow ruination of an order meant to last. Sanguinius had killed Horus to save lives in the moment. The ledger of the future had balanced on a different debt. The debt had been called in not as immediate death but as a grinding attrition of what it means to endure. The galaxy had been spared a particular apocalypse, but it was steered toward a quieter, more insidious one, an empire that loved and therefore hesitated, and hesitation turned to weakness at the wrong gates. Sanguinius listened as worlds whispered, and he asked himself the single terrible question that would haunt his sleepless centuries. Had he done right, or had he been the first domino that could not be uprighted by any hand? The answer came not in words, but in propagation tremors of change that ran through chapters, stations, nav flights, and waking prayers. Wherever people felt the angel's warmth, they were softened in a way that made steel brittle. He understood, then, as much as could be understood while sealed and suffering, that some sacrifices are not cruelty but mercy, that there are designs the universe has for its own preservation that men great and small do not get to interrupt. He felt the weight of the future like a tide against his ribs, and it was colder than any blade. When the Emperor returned to Terra in the end of that first year, he was neither triumphant nor broken. He was a figure who had seen a timeline unmade and 1,000 generations rearrange their steps. He stood at the edge of the throne room and placed the briefest of hands upon the vitrified casing that kept his sun alight. Sanguinius felt the press of that touch through 1,000 miles of star sickness and answered with a thought, "I tried. Forgive me." The Emperor's reply was a cold arithmetic and a vow. "This will be corrected," he thought. The sentence was small and absolute. It was both judgment and promise. Sanguinius, burning, answered with a bleeding tenderness that was all he had left. "Then do it," he said, not with a voice but with the last of his mercy. The universe listened. The Astronomican pulsed like a star with a heartbeat. Not the crisp, surgical brilliance it once might have possessed under the Emperor's cold mastery, but a beacon trembling with emotion. The warp felt it first, not as light, not as guidance, but as feeling, a tide of grief, a fever of hope, a strain of longing so powerful it vibrated through the non-reality of the Imperium like a plucked string. Daemons felt it like an itch, navigators felt it like a whisper, and space marines felt it like the memory of a father calling from far away, begging not for obedience, but forgiveness. It was wrong. A beacon should not have a soul, and yet Sanguinius's did. Across the Imperium, starships drifted through the warp with their navigators gripping their thrones, breath hitching, pupils dilating in patterns that charts could not explain. Some cried, some laughed, some collapsed, overwhelmed. A few even whispered prayers they did not understand. "Angel, stay with us." On Baal, chapter serfs felt tremors in their blood. On Makraj, apothecaries documented inexplicable surges of adrenaline and sorrow in their warriors. On Fenris, rune priests stared into the sky and saw an unfamiliar halo burning in the warp's skin. The galaxy was shifting in ways that had no name. Not for the first time, but for the first time because of love. Sanguinius felt everything, every single soul. From the throne he saw them all, space marines staring at their reflection and wondering why their hands trembled. Imperial commanders signing execution orders and hesitating. Civilians praying for mercy in an Imperium that had never believed in such a thing. He felt them with the ache of someone whose heart was too large for his body. But the Golden Throne was never meant for a heart. It was meant for a weapon. Locked into the machinery, Sanguinius's spirit was stretched thin over 1,000 light years, spread across the warp like a living membrane. It thinned him, shredded him, hollowed him into something no longer entirely angelic and not yet entirely monstrous. Where the Emperor would have been an icicle driven into the heart of the warp, Sanguinius became a candle, brilliant, beautiful, and slowly burning away. The warp tasted his emotions. It devoured them like nectar. And chaos fed. The first to notice were the blood angels. They were bound to him by blood and soul. Even those removed from Baal by millennia felt the tug. A whisper in their dreams. A pressure behind the eyes. A warmth in their bones. The red thirst stirred. At first it was subtle. A warrior paused longer than usual over the corpse of a slain heretic, pupils dilating at the sight of blood. Another brother felt his heartbeat accelerate during a sparring match, breath sharpening into instinctive hunger. But the flaw did not stay contained. It spread, slow, silent, psychic. No apothecary found corruption. No genseed sample showed mutation. The flaw traveled not through DNA, but through the light, through Sanguinius himself. Soon, ultramarines tasted rage during their meditations. Imperial fists felt a tremor of predatory instinct during sieges. White scars felt a momentary desire to tear their prey apart with teeth rather than blades. The soul of the Imperium had become a contagion, and the angel wept inside the throne, unable to sever the connection without breaking the Astronomican entirely. Then came the black rage, a thing that should have been contained, a trauma encoded only in the sons of Baal, became a psychic plague. It began as whispers. A Crimson Fist sergeant muttered Sanguinius's final words before the War Master. A salamander heard Horus's voice in a dream. A space wolf awoke, screaming, swearing he had seen Terra burning. Then entire squads collapsed mid-mission, gazes unfocused, murmuring, "Brother, why?" They rose with eyes full of madness, seeing not their battlefield, but the vengeful spirit's throne room, forcing them to relive a death that no longer existed. For in this new timeline, Sanguinius had not died at Horus's hand, but the psychic wound of murder, his murder of Horus, echoed through reality as if the universe itself could not decide which version of his death it preferred. The warp remembered the myth that should have been. The Marines felt the myth that wasn't. Some chapters hid these incidents, labeling them classified psychic anomalies. Others declared the fallen spiritually tainted and executed them. But the pattern grew, and Sanguinius felt every one of them like knives driven through his spirit. He had wanted to save them. He had damned them instead. His curse was not blood. It was empathy. And empathy, through the throne, was lethal. The Emperor watched the unfolding horror with a gaze sharpened by 10,000 bleeding regrets. He moved through the Imperium like an exile wearing his own face. Crowds bowed. Priests saluted. Generals knelt. But none of them worshipped. Not truly. How could they worship a god who walked beside them, visible, mortal, bleeding? How could they adore a figure who seemed more prophet than deity? The ecclesiarchy twisted itself around a new truth. Not the god emperor, but the god angel, Sanguinius, radiant in deathless agony, suffering for humanity. The emperor became a relic, a thing respected, but not revered, a teacher whose lessons were ignored, a father overshadowed by the son he had cursed to the throne. On shrine worlds, frescoes were painted not of the emperor's victory, but of Sanguinius seated upon the golden throne, wings aflame, eyes sorrowful yet resolute. Pilgrims flocked to Terra to pray beneath the glow of the Astronomican. Angel, guide us. Angel, protect us. Angel, forgive us. The emperor walked those same halls and felt his own presence dim. A living man cannot compete with a suffering myth. He visited Sanguinius only once every 100 years, not because he feared what he would see, but because he feared what he would feel. The throne room was colder than any tomb. Its glow was not fire but revelation. Each step rippled across the warp as if disturbing the surface of a black lake. Sanguinius burned at the center of it, his wings made of light, his body held together by psychic tension. The machinery fused him to eternity. He looked like a martyr sculpted by a mad god. Their eyes met. Once, those golden eyes had been gentle. Now they were galaxies burning from the inside. The emperor said nothing. There were no words left between them that were not knives. Sanguinius spoke without a mouth. His thoughts rolled through the warp in waves, bending machinery and reality alike. They suffer, Father. All of them. Because of me. The emperor kept his silence. Tell me I was wrong. The emperor could not. Not anymore. Because by then, the galaxy had begun to collapse. The orcs surged in unchecked expansion. Not from cunning, but from opportunity. They sensed weakness in the Imperium's softened responses. They laughed across battlefields, calling the humans squishy and full of feelings. Entire sectors fell beneath greenskin empires that should have been crushed early. The Tyranids arrived and feasted with unprecedented ease. Worlds hesitated to burn their infected populations. Commanders hesitated to authorize exterminatus. Mercy cost them entire systems. The Necrons awoke to find an Imperium that bled emotion like a wound. An empire ruled from a throne of agony and love. They accelerated their reclamation protocols. The Tau spread their doctrine into the cracks of imperial hesitation. The eastern fringe splintered. Chaos glutted itself. The warp thinned at Terra. Daemons slipped through realities like maggots through wet cloth. And at the center of it all, Sanguinius burned on the throne, his suffering feeding every fire. There is a kind of despair too vast for tears, a kind of guilt too deep for absolution. Sanguinius lived in that place. He had saved the Emperor. He had saved Terra. He had saved humanity. And in doing so, he had doomed them in a slower, gentler, far more tragic way. He understood now the prophecy he had shattered. He had been meant to die. Horus had been meant to kill him. His death was supposed to light a fire. The Emperor's death would ignite into godhood. Because the Imperium is not built on reason. It is built on myth. And Sanguinius had murdered that myth with love. He whispered into the warp, "Father, end this." The Emperor, walking the galaxy like a worn-out shadow, whispered back, "I will." It was a promise neither wanted to keep. But the galaxy was bleeding, and the reckoning was coming. The 13th Black Crusade was approaching, and the despoiler would do what Horus never got the chance to. Break the Imperium without even touching Terra. Abaddon did not need to strike Terra. He didn't need to challenge the Emperor, nor storm the palace, nor duel the angel burning on the throne. All he needed was to press against the cracks that were already splintering the Imperium from within. The 13th Black Crusade was not a war of conquest. It was a war of pressure applied at the precise angles where 10,000 years of compassion-softened infrastructure was weakest. Cadia was the fulcrum. The despoiler hurled the Black Legion into the gate with a fury that should have felt like vengeance. But it wasn't. It was strategy learned from the War Master he believed he was avenging. Horus had shattered the Emperor by attacking his heart. Abaddon would shatter him by dissolving everything he built. He had studied the Imperium that rose under Sanguinius's suffering light. He understood its flaws better than anyone except the Emperor himself. A kinder Imperium was a slower Imperium. A slower Imperium was a dying Imperium. When Cadia's pylons began to crack, when the Eye of Terror pulsed wider with every pulse of Sanguinius's emotional beacon, the truth became impossible to ignore. The angel's presence had become the Imperium's Achilles heel. Every wave of psychic emotion he involuntarily spread through the warp tugged at the tear of the eye. Every swell of grief made the rift throb. Every whisper of hope pulled it wider. Abaddon did not need to slay a god. He only needed to worsen the wound. The angel could not stop himself from bleeding into creation. The Emperor arrived on Cadia not as a god of legend, but as a warrior. He stepped from a lander into a night sky burning with falling debris, his armor scorched, his eyes cold with purpose. The mortal form he still inhabited moved with terrifying grace, every gesture snapping daemons out of existence like brittle glass. The Cadians watched him with awe, but it was not worship. They saw a hero. They did not see a god. And for the first time, the Emperor understood fully terribly what 10,000 years without his death had cost. For all his power, he was outmatched by a galaxy that no longer believed. Belief shapes the warp. In another timeline, he would have been fed by the prayer of trillions. In this one, he fought as a perpetual with a blade and old knowledge, still mighty, still extraordinary, but not divine. He felt the difference every time he struck down a demon and watched it crawl back together faster than it should have. On the Vengeful spirit, Sanguinius had killed the future. On Cadia, the future came to collect the debt. As the pylons collapsed and the Eye of Terror convulsed open like a screaming wound, the Emperor made a brutal calculation. He could stay and die wasted here, another warrior swallowed by the Great Rift. Or he could flee, return to Terra, and do what he should have done on the day his son sat upon the throne. He ran. Not out of cowardice, out of necessity. Cadia died buying him the seconds he needed to reach his ship. The planet cracked in half as he ascended, but his eyes were already fixed on the only place that mattered. Terra, the palace, the throne. Sanguinius. As he traveled back through the roiling warp, barely held at bay by his will, he felt the angel's light flicker. Not weaken, not dim. Flicker. A heartbeat. A plea. A final surrender. Sanguinius's mind reached out to him across impossible distances. A psychic whisper threaded with all the pain of 10,000 years. Father, end this. I cannot hold the rift. I cannot hold them. I cannot hold myself. It was the moment the Emperor had feared, and the moment he had expected. When he stepped onto Terra again, the world was chaos. Refugees filled the plazas. The Adeptus Custodes stood with silent dread. The priests of the angel screamed prayers that grew more frantic each hour. The Astronomican flickered visibly in the sky, a pulsing, unstable sun that bled emotion into the air. The Emperor entered the palace alone. No custodies followed. No servants dared approach. He descended through the catacombs, past the chambers where he had once forged an empire with his bare hands. He passed the doors sealed, with sigils only he could open. He crossed the threshold into the throne room, where the air reeked of ozone, psychic burn, and old, unending agony. And there at the center of all things Sanguinius burned. The Emperor stepped closer. The throne screamed. The angel trembled. For the first time since the siege, Sanguinius's eyes opened fully golden, luminous, drowning in grief and resignation. He did not speak aloud. He didn't need to. His father heard him clearly. It must end. The Emperor drew the weapon he had not used since the age of strife, a weapon designed not for battle, but for ending the immortal. Sanguinius bowed his head. The galaxy shifted, and the Emperor of mankind prepared to kill his most beloved son, so that humanity might finally have the god it needed, and not the angel it loved. The Emperor remembered too the day he found the angel on Baal, the pride he felt when Sanguinius led his fleets with unmatched grace, the heartbreak of the vision he himself had foreseen, and the quiet hope that maybe, somehow, the angel might escape the destiny the warp had carved for him. But there was no escape now. Not for Sanguinius. Not for the Imperium. Not for him. The weapon descended. It did not cut flesh. It cut soul. The sound that followed was not a sound at all, but a psychic convulsion that shattered through the warp like a star going supernova. Every psyker felt it. Every navigator recoiled. Every space marine dropped to his knees, clutching his head as a tidal wave of anguish, pure, incandescent, impossible anguish ripped through their gene-coded memories. The black rage erupted everywhere at once. Entire death companies went feral in the same heartbeat. Blood Angel's successors howled as the full memory of Horus's death, Sanguinius's death, collapsed upon them unfiltered. Even chapters with no connection to Baal felt the shockwave. Some fell screaming. Some stood rigid, mouths foaming with psychic residue. Some simply died, their minds unable to withstand the sudden vacuum left by the angel's extinguished presence. And through it all, the Emperor did not flinch. He stood over the rapidly dimming glow of the throne, his expression carved from grief and necessity, as the light of Sanguinius's soul withdrew from reality. The chamber dimmed, the psychic heat faded. The song of compassion that had poured from Terra for 10,000 years finally fell silent. The galaxy felt cold. For the first time since the siege of Terra, there was no angel in the Astronomican, no warmth, no sorrow, no hope, no humanity. Only emptiness. Only the lingering echo of a scream that had no sound. The Emperor lowered the weapon. A final whisper brushed his mind, weak, faint, softer than starlight. "Father, it's all right." And then Sanguinius was gone. The machine reacted instantly. The throne, denied its occupant, roared to life with the hunger of a dying god. Its pylons sparked. Its seals cracked. Its circuits wailed with machine spirits that had been pushed beyond sanity centuries ago. The rune plate overlays flared red. It needed a mind, a soul, a sacrifice. And the Emperor stepped forward. The custodians shouted warnings, but he ignored them. He placed his hands upon the arms of the throne, and the moment he made contact, the entire palace shook. The throne sank its hooks into him. Golden filaments pierced his flesh. Psychic needles stabbed into his nerves. Wires fused into bone. Ancient mechanisms older than the Imperium wrapped around his body, cocooning him in a cage designed not for a god, but for a martyr. The Emperor screamed, but his scream was not like Sanguinius's. It did not carry emotion. It did not spill grief across the warp. It was a pure force of will, meeting a machine designed to devour will. The pain did not break him, it refined him. It burned away everything that could be burned. His spirit did not shatter, it expanded. The throne tried to crush his consciousness into a shape it could manage. But the Emperor was older than the device, older than the Imperium, older than human memory. Instead of being consumed, he consumed. Instead of being trapped, he filled the throne until it nearly ruptured. Then silence. A blinding light erupted from Terra. A psychic flare so cold, so absolute, so merciless that even daemons recoiled from it. Warp storms shuddered. Daemon worlds flickered. The eye of Terra pulsed like a wounded heart. And far above Terra, the Astronomican reignited. Not golden, not warm, not gentle. It burned with cold, mathematical brilliance, an unfeeling lighthouse carved from the Emperor's absolute will. It was no longer a song. It was a command. A spear of order hurled into the warp. The galaxy gasped. Navigators wept, because what they felt now was not the angel's empathy, but something infinitely sharper. A presence that saw without pity, judged without emotion, and demanded obedience without question. The God Emperor had finally awoken. Across the Imperium, the effects were immediate. On Baal, the blood angels rose slowly from the ground, dazed. The black rage, which had flared so violently only moments before, receded like a tide drawn back by an unseen moon. The red thirst loosened. Their flaws evaporated. The genetic chains of their suffering, psychic in origin, not physical, were severed with surgical precision. Commander Dante felt it first. A weight he hadn't realized he carried slipped from his mind, leaving an aching hollowness. He gasped, because the presence he had always felt at the edge of his mind, the sense of a father watching over him, had vanished. But something else had replaced it. Cold clarity. A distant voice, whispering instructions not in words, but in purpose. He wiped blood from his lips. "The angel is gone," he whispered. And for the first time in centuries, he did not feel agony saying it. "He's freed us." Then he paused. His face grew still. "Father is risen." On Cadia's ruins, Abaddon froze mid-stride. The daemon princes around him hissed and recoiled as a psychic shockwave tore through the system. Their forms flickered. Chains of allegiance snapped. Boons granted by the dark gods evaporated like steam. The War Master of Chaos felt something he had not felt since the siege of Terra. Fear. A familiar voice whispered across the warp, not to him, but through him, like a law woven into reality itself. "Abaddon," it said, "your time is over." Abaddon roared in denial, clawing at his helm, his demon-forged armor writhing as if in pain. "You cannot return," he screamed into the warp. "You cannot take back what was lost. This galaxy belongs to Chaos." And for the first time in 10,000 years, Chaos did not answer. In the webway, the Eldari seers felt it too. They staggered as the psychic winds shifted violently. Farsia Iana Arienal dropped her staff, clutching her chest as she bled from the eyes. "Impossible," she whispered. The runes hovering before her did not scatter, they froze, as if held by an invisible hand. "A Mon-K god has been born." On Mars, the Fabricator General collapsed to his knees as every cogitator on the planet blared the same warning. Astronomican signal. Unprecedented. Source: Emperor of Mankind. Designation: Divinity Protocol active. The tech priests turned their augmetics toward Terra, chanting Binharic hymns in terror and awe. The Omnissiah had awakened. On Terra, the custodians knelt not out of reverence, but because they had to. The psychic pressure was unbearable. The Emperor was present everywhere at once, inside their minds, inside the palace, inside the warp. He was no longer a wandering remnant of the past. He was a god, and gods do not whisper. They impose. One custodian dared to look up, one, and he saw the throne in its newly awakened form glowing with power so intense it burned shadows into the walls. The Emperor sat motionless. His flesh was reduced to bone and gold. His eyes were empty sockets brimming with blinding psychic light. His voice echoed through the galaxy without sound. "Humanity shall endure." And far above Terra, the Astronomican pulsed again, sharper, brighter, colder. No matter the cost. The galaxy felt the change before anyone could name it. The warp recoiled. Reality stiffened. A cold gravity of purpose drew every living soul just a little closer, as if an invisible hand had taken hold of the stars themselves and ordered them to obey. And on Terra, beneath a sky that crackled with auroras of psychic discharge, the Emperor's first decree, unspoken, unvoiced, yet absolute, began reshaping the Imperium with terrifying speed. The Imperium had always been bureaucratic, slow, half-dead. But now, everywhere at once, the machinery awakened. An administratum clerk on Hydrafer blinked at her data slate as the equations began rewriting themselves. Efficiency algorithms she'd never seen activated without command. Her quill servitor, dead for weeks, suddenly sparked to life and scrawled a new, impossible directive. All error tolerance removed. 0 deviation. 0 hesitation. 0 mercy. She whispered a prayer she hadn't said since childhood. "Father?" the data slate answered. "The Imperium must survive." On Armageddon, Commissar Yarrick paused mid-sentence during a briefing. Every officer in the room felt it. A psychic cold wind slicing through the brutal heat of the world like the breath of a god. The orcs outside the fortress walls howled as the wind passed, confused and enraged. Yarrick murmured, "The Emperor walks." And then his mind sharpened painfully, violently as a single directive cut through his thoughts like a blade. End the orcs. Permanently. He felt iron resolve flood through him. No doubt, no fear, no hesitation. What he felt now was not courage. It was programming. On Macragge, Manius Calgar knelt in the Hall of Heroes as Gilliman's stasis field flickered once, just once, as if the Primarch within sensed the shift. Calgar raised his head slowly. The Father has taken the throne. He could feel it in his gene seed. The subtle whispering influence of Sanguinius compassion, sorrow, hope, was gone, evaporated, replaced by something vaster, something surgical, something perfect. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Ultramarines felt truly directionless. Without Sanguinius's emotional bleed seeping into their souls, they were left with a void the Emperor would soon fill. A voice not spoken, but imposed echoed in the chapter master's mind. Prepare for compliance war. The Imperium must be reforged. Calgar bowed his head. As you command, my Emperor. In the eye of terror, Daemon worlds flickered as if someone had pulled back the curtain of unreality and exposed the truth beneath. Daemons screamed not in pain, but in confusion. Their forms crackled, destabilized, weakened. Something in the warp had become toxic to them. Something cold, something real, something that despised them without emotion. A keeper of secrets clawed at its own chest, shrieking, "Not this, he is not supposed to ascend this way." A great unclean one bellowed, its belly splitting open as the rot inside evaporated into pure psychic frost. No, the warmth is gone. The warp is colder. A bloodthirster roared and swung its axe at nothing, desperate to kill the feeling spreading through the immaterium. The feeling of being hunted. But Tzientch felt it most. The architect of fate reeled, its crystal palaces fracturing under waves of order. The timeline was shifting again. This was never supposed to happen. He whispered in 1,000 directions at once. The wrong god has awakened. On Terra, the custodian guard stood in perfect formation around the golden throne, though every one of them trembled behind their auramite helm. Not from fear. Fear was a mortal weakness. This was something else. Overwhelmed awe. The throne room had become a blinding cyclone of psychic energy. Gold-white light poured from the Emperor's skeletal frame in steady pulses that shook dust from the pillars and made the air ripple like heat haze. He no longer resembled a man. He resembled the idea of judgment given shape. The Lord Commander of the Custodians knelt. His voice cracked not from emotion, but because speaking in that room was like shouting into the heart of a star. "My Emperor, what are your orders?" The answer arrived not as words but as absolute truth slammed into every mind on Terra. Rebuild the Imperium from the bones of the weak. Erase failure. Erase hesitation. Restore unity. The air shook. The lights exploded. Servo skulls dropped from the ceiling, smoking. And bring my broken galaxy to heal. The first to respond were the Space Marines. Freed from Sanguinius's inherited anguish, their minds became sharp and cold again. The emotional shackles they hadn't even realized they were carrying fell away. Entire chapters snapped into brutal clarity. The black rage vanished from the blood angels like a candle snuffed out. The red thirst evaporated in seconds. The sons of Baal staggered, gasping, as 1,000 years of psychic agony lifted. Yet they did not feel joy. They felt emptiness. Captain Tycho touched his temple, shocked. He's gone. And then he felt the other presence, unyielding, absolute. The Emperor is inside us. Brother Corbulo dropped to his knees, breath shaking. This is what perfection feels like. They were not wrong. The gene seed of the Adeptus Astartes, forged from the Emperor's own essence, resonated perfectly with his ascendant presence. For the first time since the Heresy, Space Marines became what they had been designed to be: emotionless, relentless, divinely guided, pure. Weapons, not men. But it was not only the Space Marines who felt the Emperor's ascension. Billions of citizens across 1,000,000 worlds heard a whisper in their sleep. Stand. Billions obeyed. Hive workers who had known nothing but exhaustion stood straighter. Criminals in underhives froze, suddenly aware of judgment watching them. Pilots felt their hands steady. Commanders felt their doubts dissolve. Mothers and children felt a presence that was neither kind nor harsh, simply inevitable. For the first time in 10,000 years, humanity felt unified, not by love, not by faith, not by hope, but by force. A single iron will pressed into the soft clay of an entire species, and chaos felt humanity slip through its fingers. But not everything aligned, not everyone bowed. Far from terror, in the scattered remnants of Sanguinius's psychic shadow, a few sparks of resistance began to flicker. Not rebellion, no one dared rebel, but something older, something sadder, something that had belonged to the angel alone. On a little shrine world devoted to Sanguinius, a boy praying before a statue suddenly burst into tears. His mother rushed to him. "What's wrong?" he sobbed. "He's gone, Mama. The angel, he's gone." The mother felt nothing. No sorrow, no echo, no warmth. She stared at her child, disturbed, because she realized she felt another presence, watching her, measuring her, judging her, a presence that did not care about tears, or fear, or love. Humanity was becoming obedient, but it was also becoming empty. Back on Terra, the Emperor reshaped the throne. The machine shuddered, straining to contain his expanding presence. Circuits melted, metal warped, psychic conduits burned white-hot. Tech priests fled screaming, blood pouring from their eyes. They had always believed the throne was too powerful, too complex, too sacred for mortal hands. But they were wrong. It was never powerful enough. The Emperor reached into the warp not to call daemons, but to crush the paths they walked. He sealed breaches that had existed since the Dark Age. He snapped minor warp rifts like threads. He locked entire daemon worlds behind psychic iron. The warp cried out. The Emperor did not hear it. He sat in stillness, burning, becoming, rewriting the rules. For the first time in history, chaos understood fear of a different kind, not the fear of annihilation, but the fear of irrelevance. Because if the Emperor's will continued spreading cold, perfect, merciless, their playground would become a prison, and humanity would no longer need them. But the galaxy is vast, and no ascension, no matter how powerful, comes without consequences. In the emptiness between stars, something stirred, something old, something that remembered the Emperor not as a god, but as a rival, a challenger, a pretender. In the silent depths of a forgotten tomb world, a Necron overlord awoke from stasis and spoke a single word in a dead tongue. Finally, far across the eastern fringe, Tau Seers felt a sudden spike of collective human unity and froze in terror. This changes everything," whispered an ethereal. And in the blackened edges of the great rift still roaring, but dimmer, the dark gods began to plot again. Because even gods adapt, even chaos evolves. And the Emperor's ascension had not ended their war. It had begun a new one where the Imperium would no longer break slowly. It would break quickly, violently, gloriously, or transform into something worse than anything the galaxy had ever seen. Something colder, something unstoppable, something worthy of a god, not of love, but of survival. The galaxy shifted around the Emperor's ascension like a great beast turning in its sleep. Every species, human or otherwise, felt the psychic tremor ripple through reality. It was not subtle, it was not gentle. It was a proclamation made of iron will and absolute purpose. In the bowels of the great rift, demons shuddered as the light carved through the warp. On distant forge worlds, machines awakened as if the Omnissiah had finally spoken. Across 1,000,000 planets, humanity exhaled as one, but not with relief. With obedience, the Emperor's will spread outward like a neural network, stitching itself through the minds of the faithful and unfaithful alike. There were no words, no commands, no sermons. Just pressure. The kind of pressure that stopped rebellions before they were born. That made a planetary governor reconsider corruption before it happened. That made a heretic priest forget his doubt in the moment before he whispered it. It was guidance without compassion, clarity without warmth, perfection without mercy. Humanity was being sculpted, and the galaxy began to respond. In the segmentum solar, the Imperial Navy reorganized itself with inhuman precision. Admirals found themselves drafting new battle doctrines without understanding how the ideas came to them. Fleets fell into formations unseen since the Great Crusade. On the bridge of Battlefleet Solar, Admiral Halbrecht stared at the tactical hololith. "This isn't strategy," he whispered. "This is inevitability." He didn't know where the thought came from. He didn't question it. Because the Emperor did not inspire obedience. He installed it. Further from terror, on the borders of the cicatrix maledictum, the forces of chaos felt the shift in a different way, like a sudden, violent pressure drop before a storm. World-Eater's berserkers stopped mid-charge as their rage faltered for half a heartbeat. A keeper of secrets froze in its dance, confused as its sensory field dulled. A lord of change screeched as the skeins of fate it relied upon twisted into new, unnatural configurations. In a fortress built from the bones of a dead titan, Abaddon himself lifted Drachnien and felt the blade tremble. "What is this?" A voice whispered back, not with taunting amusement, but with something dangerously close to worry. "He approaches the throne we denied him 10,000 years ago." Abaddon's grip tightened. "No, he rises now, which means we must change the plan." The blade growled in agreement. Because this war had never been about victory. It had always been about timing. And the timeline had just snapped again. In the eastern fringe, Tau ethereals felt their serenity fracture. "What is this psychic suffocation?" whispered Anva, gripping his staff tightly. "It is not suffocation," answered a watercast diplomat, eyes wide with terror. "It is unity, forced unity." The Tau did not understand psychic power. But they understood coercion, and they understood when an empire larger than their dreams awakened to full consciousness. "This will change everything," Anva said. He was right. But the most profound shift occurred within the Adeptus Astartes. The Space Marines, born of the Emperor's genetic artistry, felt his ascendancy like a second heartbeat, synchronizing with their own. The Sanguinian curse vanished. The psychic distortions that had plagued their minds evaporated. Yet this did not bring peace. It brought a kind of sharpened emptiness. Brother Tarek of the Imperial Fists stood before his reflection, frowning. Something was missing, something important. Emotion. Not all of it. Just enough to make him efficient. Perfect. Absolute. He touched his chest. "I feel hollow." His chaplain placed a gauntleted hand on his pauldron. That hollow is his will. Across other chapters, similar realizations dawned. Space Marines no longer fought against their flaws. They fought exactly as the Emperor intended, without distraction, without remorse, without hope, just purpose. On Baal, Dante stood before the Tower of the Lost, empty now, silent. No more black rage, no more screams of doomed brothers reliving their father's final battle. He should have felt joy. He felt nothing. The angel's psychic echo had vanished. The father they prayed to was gone, and in the silence left behind, another presence pressed in cold, immense, impersonal. Dante bowed his head. "This is the Imperium we feared, the Imperium we needed." But though Sanguinius was dead, something of him lingered. Not in the Astronomican, not in the Emperor's vast psychic shadow, not in the souls of the Astartes. He drifted elsewhere. In the warp. In the cracks between thought and dream. In the quiet spaces where echoes go when their source is gone. Here, Sanguinius's consciousness floated dim, but intact. He saw the galaxy reacting to his death. He saw the Emperor ascending. He saw chaos recoiling. And he wept. In death, his tears made no sound. They fell into the warp like motes of golden light. Each tear burned with regret. He had wanted to save them. Instead, he had softened them, made them vulnerable, allowed them to survive but not to triumph. The Emperor had corrected that mistake, and Sanguinius watched, powerless, as the Imperium he had shaped was peeled away layer by layer and reforged into its older, harsher design. A design that no longer needed compassion. A design that no longer needed him. His wings dimmed. He drifted. Yet he was not alone. For in the black between worlds, something watched him with endless patience. A voice, ancient and sorrowful, whispered, "Angel, your suffering is not over." Sanguinius turned, or the soul shadow that had once been him did, and saw the shape emerging from the warp's lightless horizon. Tall, hooded, silent. He recognized the presence immediately. Not chaos. Not the Emperor. Not the warp itself. But something that had followed Primarchs since the day they were scattered. Something older. Something inevitable. "You again," Sanguinius whispered into the void. The figure nodded. It was the same presence that had appeared before Vulcan countless times. The same presence that had stood beside Conrad Cursor in his final moment. The same presence that had watched Horus fall. Death. Literal death. A being that did not wear a name. "You come to take me?" Sanguinius asked. Death shook its head. "Not take." Its voice was the rustle of a shroud. "Witness." The angel felt dread coil around him. "Witness what?" Death drifted closer, lifting a skeletal hand. Reality thinned. The warp split open, and Sanguinius saw the future unfolding. Not the future the Emperor was forging. Another one. Darker, colder, far more catastrophic. A future no one in the galaxy was prepared for. Death whispered, "The Emperor ascends," but something else awakens in response. Sanguinius felt his soul quiver. "What awakens?" Death answered, "Everything he defeated before." The angel shook. "No, he beat them. He killed them. Death cut him off. Not killed. Delayed." The vision widened. Sanguinius saw stars dimming. He saw titanic shadows rising. He saw the Necrons stirring. He saw the Tyranids converging. He saw chaos evolving. He saw humanity hardening into something barely human. He saw the galaxy preparing for a war unlike any that had come before. The final war. Death lowered its hand. "He rises." So they rise. Balance demands it. Sanguinius felt his spirit flicker. "What do you want from me?" Death answered softly, "To prepare you for what comes next." And then the vision shattered. Sanguinius was alone again. Alone with the knowledge that even in death, his curse was not over.